In this video we're going to be taking a look at this old Seiko manual wind watch. This particular one was quite interesting in a little bit of glue residue where somebody's glued a crystal in the past there. This one's quite interesting in that I picked this up from a watch shop in Yorkshire. And it's a little bit of a sob story kind of fix, this one. I'm a bit of a sucker for sob stories, I've got to admit, and this one kind of touched me a little bit. And I was chatting to a fella who'd got a watch shop in Yorkshire, and he was telling me he had a customer who came in and had brought him a couple of old Seikos. This particular one's a manual wind model, and it was the last watch that his wife had bought him before she passed away, and for that reason it's very dear to him for sentimental reasons, and he wanted to have it serviced and looked at and repaired because it wasn't running. And unfortunately the fella at the watch store wasn't able to get this done because the person that they normally used, I believe, was retiring, calling it a day or something along those lines. And so he told me the story of it, and I had a brief look at it in the shop, and I could see that there were some things that needed addressing immediately. For example, there are on immediate inspection, when I opened up the back of the case, I noticed that it was missing a chaton capsule and shock spring from the balance side. I don't know anything about the dial side as yet. So it's going to need a few parts, which hopefully I'll be able to scavenge from the other watch, which is an automatic Seiko 7005, I believe. So things such as the chaton and cap jewel and what have you. But hopefully we'll be able to get this clean serviced and running for the fella. And I'm going to give it a little bit of a clean up. You can see it's got some scuffing on the crystal, which has at some point been replaced. As I say, it had a little bit of residue down here, still a little bit here and there, which looks like an adhesive that was used to secure the crystal in place. So yes, we're going to take this apart, we're going to strip it, check it all, give it a good clean, and hopefully get this back together and running again. So we'll start with removal of the case back and movement. And just looking at the case back here, and we have got 6602, 8050, 6602 I believe is the movement caliber. And I've not actually stripped one of this particular caliber before, although I have done numerous manual wind movements, and they are always simpler in operation than the automatics for obvious reasons. You've got less components, and it's a relatively simple, only a date complication on this, unlike the day-date complications that you typically get with Seikos. So we're going to go ahead, uncase this, and strip it down. So here I'm removing the two screws that hold the movement ring in place. The first one comes undone with no problem. The second one, however, I don't know how visible it is on there, but had corroded at some point in the past, and half of the head was missing. And here you see the movement ring removed, but this particular part was not straightforward at all. The area where I'm pointing and where I have the screwdriver just there shows a solid rubber O-ring which has just been in there for years and has set solid. I've just paused here briefly because first of all I need to quickly make a new movement holder on the 3D printer, because I don't have one that's the exact size. I could use my metal one, but I actually prefer these 3D printed ones. Being plastic, I know they don't harm anything, and they hold everything very, very firmly as well. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new one for the movement before I start stripping the movement down. But just to show you here, if we get this in the frame, what was stopping the movement ring, this piece here, from coming out freely, was this very, very old and perished rubber O-ring that you can see there. It's literally just falling apart. So the good thing is now the movement ring is out, it's coming out easily, but you can see that's just perished and it's brittle and absolutely useless. So that will need a new O-ring fitting upon reassembly, and I will also need to take a look. I'm going to give this whole thing a clean up anyway and try and clean up the crystal, give that a bit of a polish to get some of the scratches out. It has a tension ring fitted, but at some point this has been glued into place, so I need to take a look at that and make sure that that's okay there. I mean, it's certainly not something I would advise getting wet anyway, just by the very nature of its design. It's not got a screw down crown or anything like that, but it should be adequate to be splash proof. So this is going to get a good clean. Give this a good scrub, all the bracelet and everything, with some soapy water, and get that rinsed and dried. So that will be nice and clean, and a bit of polish on the crystal there to hopefully shine that up and make the face a bit more visible. You'll note here, just going back to the dial, there is some discoloration on the dial. We've got a shiny area here where the rest of the dial is quite matte, and I'm wondering if at some point somebody has used the glue that has been used in the past, has perhaps been something like cyanoacrylate, which has fogged up this a little bit, causing this shiny area, or whether this has just maybe rubbed somewhere, because obviously it's all supposed to be an overall matte finish like this. I'm not too sure, but to be quite honest, it doesn't really detract from the appearance of it in the case. As you can see, it's not enormously visible once it's all in place in there, so I'm not too worried about that. Here we see the case and crystal cleaned up, and it's overall just had a good clean, and the acrylic crystal has been polished. There are still a couple of deep scratches in there that I couldn't get out, but it's considerably better than it was. So now we move on to stripping the dial side of the watch. The hands have already been removed. I thought I was filming at the point I was removing those. Unfortunately I wasn't. However, it was just the usual process, using a plastic protective sleeve and hand lifters, and there I'm pointing out the dial feet screws. With those removed, the dial lifts away cleanly. And other than the shiny portion, is in really good condition. Mounting the movement into the printed movement holder. First of all, I remove the foil or dial washer, followed by the hour wheel. Next is this cover plate, which is retained by 3 small screws. Here I'm using a piece of pegwood to hold down the jumper spring while I ease that out with a pair of tweezers. This is the jumper spring for the date wheel. Followed by the date wheel jumper and the date wheel itself. This geared section here, which operates the motion of the date wheel, although it looks as if it's 3 separate components, appears to be assembled and fixed together as one component. So rather than pry further with that, I just decided to put that through the wash with the rest of the parts as one piece, and we'll see if that stays together. Here I'm removing the 3 screws that hold down the cover plate that you see there, and you'll notice that one of these screws is considerably longer than the other 2, so you'll need to take careful note of which goes where for reassembly. We can now remove the minute wheel and then the cannon pinion. You'll note also on this side that the cap jewel is in place, which is quite good. It means I only had to source the 1 Chaton cap jewel and Diashock spring. There we're moving the plastic spacer ring, which gives us access to the keyless works. Again, you'll note that there are 2 different sizes of screw, which will need to be noted for reassembly. So having removed the cover plate and the yoke, remove the setting lever and the release pin. And at this point the winding stem is removed to allow removal of the winding pinion and the clutch wheel. Now on to the motion side. We begin by removing the balance cock, seen here with the missing end stone. This is a very tight fit and needs to be pried very carefully because the hairspring is quite a delicate part. And more about that hairspring in a little while. And now we're disassembling the winding gears for the mainspring. Followed by the click and the click spring. It's worth noting at this point that the quality of manufacture is considerably, visibly and noticeably better than any of the Seiko automatic movements I've worked on previously. It's a really nicely made movement. And note the left hand thread on this screw, denoted by the triple lines. Next for removal is the pallet cock. I had actually turned that towards the camera to give you a better view of that, but I had to turn that back to make it easier to manipulate the screw and the pallet cock out of the way. And then following this, we remove the pallet fork. Although I didn't mention it earlier in the video, but the mainspring power was let down initially at the start. Here I'm removing the first of the 3 screws that hold the main bridge plate for the train and barrel down, and once again you'll note that there are 2 screws of the same size and 1 of a different size, which again must be noted for reassembly. With the longer one being the one nearest the barrel. The main plate lifts away quite cleanly there, and then we can remove the fourth wheel, third wheel and the escape wheel. Followed by the mainspring barrel. And the final component being the second wheel or centre wheel bridge or cock. Which is retained by one screw there. And this completes the disassembly of the movement to its component parts, ready to be put in the basket for the cleaning machine. Here I'm removing the mainspring using a polybag just to make sure the cap of the barrel doesn't ping off. And the mainspring is removed as per usual by removing the cap, the barrel arbor, and then allowing the mainspring to uncoil itself whilst guided by thumbs or thumbnails. The movement, I have to say, was surprisingly clean inside given its reluctance to run, but if anything it was probably devoid of lubricant. It's more a case of it's dried up rather than it's been over lubricated or some such. So it has been looked after in the past by the look of it, but it's obviously been a long time since it was serviced, and very clean inside. But there was another reason pointing to its reluctance to run, in addition to the missing cap jewel, which we'll look at in just a moment. And although it's very hard to see here, the balance, while in reasonably good condition, had a noticeable problem on the terminal curve of the hairspring. Unfortunately, I don't have a camera that can get in close enough to view this, but that required some fettling and reshaping, and I think it will require some further reshaping as well. And finally, I'm replacing the balance along with a Chaton cap jewel and a dia shock spring that were taken from the other movement prior to this going into the cleaning machine.